She outlived all of Henry's other wives and became known as a generous, easygoing woman and a good housekeeper, which was considered much more of a compliment in the 16th century than you might find it today. Hi everyone, it's Margot here with another episode of Crown and Kingdom. Today I'm going to be delving into one of British history's most popular topics, the wives of King Henry VIII. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, sometimes referred to as the Ugly One, or even the Flanders Mare. I'm going to take you back in time to find out just how Anne got these nicknames, who gave them to her, and how this seemingly huge insult actually paved the way for Anne to become one of the richest and most fabulous women in all of England. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help me keep my channel growing. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. The wives of King Henry VIII have fascinated people for centuries, and there's been no shortage of their depiction on stage and screen. Anne Boleyn seems to be the runaway favorite, while Catherine of Aragon receives recognition for her long service and status as Henry's first queen. Henry himself is buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, and she gave birth to his only legitimate son, so for that she receives some notoriety. Catherine Howard is often reduced to the label of the foolish one, the cheater, or simply just the other one that Henry executed. Catherine Parr is the one who survived, and Anne of Cleves is, by popular consensus, the ugly one. In terms of Google searches related to Henry VIII's wives, one of the most commonly asked questions is, who was the ugliest wife of Henry VIII? Luckily for us, multiple websites exist to inform us of the fact that it was indeed Anne of Cleves. Imagine having spent your entire childhood being a modestly important pawn in a European diplomatic game of chess, your very existence and a forced marriage used to bring power and prosperity to your entire country. You bravely leave your home and live abroad, married to a man you've never even met before, who, shortly after you do finally meet, banishes you from court and publicly alleges that you lied to him about your sexual past. You stay friends with him and act as stepmother to his children. In fact, you're the only stepmother they have who they actually care for, so much so that you play prominent roles at their coronation ceremonies, potentially engaging in subterfuge to enable one of them to take their rightful place on the throne. You're described by contemporaries as courteous, gentle, and kind to your staff, and you're buried in the church, Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives afforded this honor. Not only that, but you're the last of his wives to die, having outlived the last by 9 years. You've lived a full life, a full 42 years on earth, seemingly improving the lives of all who knew you, and yet, for centuries to come, people will still learn about you as simply the ugly one. It's a tough pill to swallow, to have your entire existence boiled down to the fact that you're unattractive, and it's tougher still because it isn't even true. Born in Dusseldorf to John III, Duke of Cleves and Count of Mark, and Maria of Jülichburg in either June or September of 1515, Anne grew up in what is now Germany, but what was then the Duchy of Cleves. Not much is known about her early life, but by the age of 11, her hand in marriage was already a bargaining chip at her family's disposal. A collapsed engagement to the heir of the Duke of Lorraine, himself only 9, is her first appearance on political history's radar, and it wouldn't be until 1539 that she would appear on Henry's. Henry's heart was said to be truly broken after the death of his third wife, Jane Seymour, in 1537, and he did not immediately seek a replacement. But Henry had dynastic pressures upon him. His father had been considered by some to be a usurper, and Henry had distant family with strong claims to the throne, who all seemed to have a very nasty habit of plotting to take it away from him. But don't worry, they were all eventually dispatched in one way or another. The king needed to secure his Tudor dynasty. Henry had just one son, and in a time when the baby's survival was not guaranteed, and to a man who had already borne witness to his wife's numerous miscarriages and stillbirths, as well as the deaths of at least one of his previous babies, one son was not enough. Henry would need to marry again. To this end, Henry ended up creating his 16th century version of Tinder. He commissioned his favorite artist, Hans Holbein, to travel to various royal palaces in varying countries to paint the portraits of unmarried noble women, all eligible to become the English queen. The portraits were then brought back home for Henry's assessment, to swipe left or right, so to speak. Henry's first choice was Christina of Denmark, the widowed Duchess of Milan, who was a mere 16 to Henry's 47. However, Henry had largely garnered a reputation for the mistreatment of his wives. At this point, he had divorced one, executed the next, and the third had died, which, let's be honest, is not a great track record. So it is quite understandable that Christina herself was not exactly thrilled with the prospect of marrying the English king. An oft-told tale is that she reportedly stated, quote, "If I had 2 heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal." Christina's mother, as well as her aunts, were all nieces of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, so you can imagine the attitude toward the king in their households. Yet Henry pursued the marriage for nearly a year, until the English diplomat in Brussels kindly suggested that the king should, quote, "fix his most noble stomach in some such other place." It was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who first suggested Anne of Cleves as a bride for the English king. The King of France, Francis I, and the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had recently made peace, and the threat of a Catholic invasion seemed strong. Anne's father, the Duke of Cleves, was seen as a key ally against this new united force. So, for want of a better term, Henry logged back into Tinder, and Holbein was sent back to Europe to paint 2 more portraits, perhaps the most infamous royal art commission in British history. I say 2 portraits because Holbein also painted Anne's younger sister, Amalia. 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. Although Holbein's portrait of Amalia has been lost to time, this sketch is thought to have been the basis for it. After seeing the portraits, Henry chose Anne, although there is debate as to whether this was because he found her the more beautiful, or because, as the eldest, she would have had more hereditary rights in her homeland, something that could one day prove useful for Henry's political leverage. Holbein's painting of Anne is eye-catching, although more so for her elaborate dress rather than her personage. Her expression is neutral, neither happy nor sad, although the ghost of a smile seems to tug at the corners of her mouth. Her hands are clasped demurely in front of her, and she stares straight out from the canvas, her heavy-lidded dark eyes revealing no emotion, which, admittedly, is a little odd for a Holbein piece, as he largely, though not entirely, preferred painting his sitters facing slightly to the side. Beauty is objective, of course, but there's nothing about her appearance that one would describe as ugly. Anne is depicted wearing a richly made gown of a regal red that is trimmed with gold, with swathes of fabric wrapped around her arms. She's wearing a large amount of jewelry, rings, and necklaces, along with jewels on her headpiece and the collar of her gown. Some point to this as proof that Anne was unattractive, insisting that Holbein focused on her attire rather than her face in his portrait, a subtle clue that when it came to her face, there wasn't much to look at. It's also worth remembering that she was wearing clothing that was considered strange or out of fashion in England at the time. However, contemporary reports of Anne were full of praise for her beauty. A member of Thomas Cromwell's household, who travelled to Cleves, reported back to the king that, quote, "Everyone praises the lady's beauty, both of face and body. One said that she excelled the Duchess of Milan as the golden sun did the silver moon." The French ambassador reported that Anne was, quote, "of middling beauty," which seems perhaps more realistic than comparisons to the sun. Upon seeing the portraits of the sisters, the English ambassador, Nicholas Wotton, one of the few English people to have seen Anne in person, declared that the artist, quote, "hath expressed their images very lively," or lifelike. Remember, Holbein was chosen by Henry for his skill in accurately representing his subjects. Edward Hall, a contemporary historian, tells us that she had a lovely face, quote, "her hair hanging down, which was yellow and long. She was apparelled after the English fashion, with a French hood, which so set forward her beautiful and fair visage, that every creature rejoiced to behold her." So, then why has she gone down in history as so scandalously ugly? It would seem Anne spent the last 500 years taking the fall for Henry's embarrassment and impotence, a situation not necessarily unknown to the ladies of modernity who may be watching or listening to this now. Henry and Anne's first meeting, it's fair to say, was a disaster. Anne had arrived in England via Dover and was spending the night in Rochester at the Abbey before making her way to London. When Anne and her ladies were upstairs, looking out of the window into the courtyard, a group of men dressed in strange disguises burst into the room, shouting in English, which Anne did not yet understand. The women were shocked, and some scared, even more so when one of the men approached Anne, threw his arms around her, and kissed her. He then produced a gift for her, saying it was from the king, who had sent it to her as a New Year's present. Anne tried to remain composed and polite, pushing him gently away and attempting to just go back to looking out the window, unsure how to react appropriately to what was happening. Seeing that she would not pay him the attention he was after, the man left the room, only to return a few moments later without his disguise, wearing instead a royal coat of purple velvet, revealing himself as no wild intruder, but in fact the king. At his re-entrance to the room, it is said that all the knights and ladies fell to their knees and gave him reverence. What Anne didn't know was that Henry was a keen actor, engaging in masques and plays at court, and this strange event was him acting out a play of sorts, a chivalric display designed to bring drama and fun to their first meeting. This was a known courtly tradition that usually played out well, provided all parties understood what was happening. The traditional process would be that the man, wearing a clever disguise, would come upon his love interest unexpectedly, perhaps acting uncouth or dim. However, the bride-to-be would immediately see through this disguise, recognize her true love, and swoon into the arms of her soon-to-be husband. Everybody claps and laughs and lives happily ever after. So imagine Henry's surprise when Anne not only rebuffed his advances, but failed to recognize him and, quote, regarded him little, just wishing to be left alone to look out the window. According to chronicler Charles Risley, it was game over from that very moment. Upon leaving the room, Henry told his friends, quote, "I see nothing in this woman as men report of her, and, damningly, I like her not." Anne had embarrassed Henry in front of his friends and the new arrivals from the Cleves court, and it could not be true love between them because she did not recognize him immediately. Henry also valued education and courtly sophistication in his women, which he immediately decided Anne did not have. Henry left in a huff, and he and Anne would officially meet 3 days later in Blackheath, but the damage was done. However, this was meant to be a political marriage, which meant Henry couldn't just change his mind. Thomas Cromwell, who had suggested the match from the start, was tasked with finding a way out for the king. This couldn't be done, however, before the wedding took place, so Henry and Anne were wed on the 9th of January, 1540, at the Royal Palace of Greenwich. Their wedding night went about as well as you'd imagine. The morning after, Henry confided to Cromwell that the marriage was not consummated. The king said that Anne's breasts were too large, and that they were saggy, and she had a, quote, loose belly, which meant she likely wasn't a true virgin. He further claimed that she had, quote, very evil smells about her. His full report was summed up when he said, I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse. According to Henry, he did his best for the next 4 nights to consummate his marriage, but couldn't, and I'm sorry to be crass, get it up. Innocent Anne, however, seems to have had no idea that anything was missing. Speaking to the Countess of Rutland, she praised Henry, saying he was a kind and loving husband. He reported, quote, when he comes to bed, he kisseth me, and he taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me, good night, sweetheart, and in the morning biddeth me, farewell, darling. As far as Anne knew, this was enough. Lady Rutland replied with the truth, however, stating, quote, Madam, there must be more than this, or it will be long ere we have a Duke of York. The Duke of York is the title given to the king's second eldest son. Lady Rutland knew that no child would be born of kisses, a fact it's unclear if Anne was aware of. It was also reported that Henry and Anne had nothing in common. She was not versed in English courtly traditions, such as dancing, preferring to practice needlework or play card games. And she had not yet mastered the English language, so there was little to discuss between them. These are things that can change in time, but Henry felt that he didn't have any to waste. Keep in mind that at this point in Henry's life, he was nearly 50 and suffering from gout. A jousting accident in 1536 had left him with a wound on his leg that would not heal and was constantly and painfully infected. Some members of court reported that people knew when the king was on his way because they could smell his leg before he walked into the room. He was rapidly gaining weight, was winded when walking upstairs, and was covered in painful boils. Philippa Gregory put it best when she said, quote, there was indeed a fat, stinking, unsexy person in Henry VIII's bed, but it was not the 24-year-old woman. My point being, there is no evidence Henry was even up to the task of consummating his marriage. Combine this with 2 other factors. Firstly, Anne's father had recently become embroiled in a dispute with the Holy Roman Emperor, and Henry's alliance with him looked poised to pull England into a foreign dispute. And secondly, Henry's eye was already on somebody else, his soon-to-be 5th wife, the 17-year-old Catherine Howard. Henry wanted out of his marriage and insisted that Thomas Cromwell find a way. 6 months after their marriage, most of which was spent living apart, Anne was ordered to leave court. Shortly thereafter, she was told that her husband wished to annul their union. But Henry needed a reason, so he embarked on what was, essentially, a smear campaign to create for himself a legal way out of his nuptial misery. Members of court were officially interviewed and witness statements were taken, all of which agreed that Anne was not beautiful, that Henry had been lied to, and that she was, quote, nothing so fair as she hath been reported. One member of court recorded, quote, according to several who have seen her close, she does not seem so young as expected, nor so beautiful as everyone affirmed. He kindly added, however, that her ladies-in-waiting were even less attractive, but they all wore clothes so hideous that it would have made anyone look ugly. Aside from his charming commentary, note that this man admits to never having actually seen Anne close up, and yet his opinion has been recorded as fact. Henry's accusation that her body could not be that of a virgin was spread around court, and 2 physicians were involved in the case. To prove that Henry was capable of marriage consummation, they reported in court that Henry had, just recently, 2, quote, nocturnal pollutions while he was asleep, and, having successfully used his first wife's previous marriage as a solid reason for divorce decades before, Henry and Cromwell brought up Anne's failed previous engagement to the Duke of Lorraine when she was 11 as a sign of her unsuitability as a marriage partner. Henry successfully managed to argue that Anne was simply too ugly to be married to, and that unfair accusation has stayed with her for centuries. Some have suggested that Henry's opinion about her looks was valid, and perhaps Hans Holbein had just painted a particularly overly flattering portrait of his future queen, so when Henry saw her in the flesh, he was naturally disappointed. This argument doesn't seem to hold much weight, no pun intended, when you consider the consequences of getting on Henry's bad side. Thomas Cromwell, who orchestrated the ill-fated union, didn't last much longer than the marriage itself. When Henry and the French king made a loose alliance, Cromwell's political gambit of marrying Henry to the Duke of Cleves' daughter seemed pointless in retrospect. He was accused of sharing sensitive information about the king to others, was labeled a traitor, said to be corrupt, accused of protecting Protestants from heresy, and declared to be secretly plotting to marry the king's daughter. It's a long list, but everybody, including Cromwell himself, knew that he was really being punished for the embarrassment of the king's failed marriage. Cromwell was condemned to death without trial and was beheaded on the 28th of July, 1540, the very same day Henry married his 5th wife, Catherine Howard. But Thomas did not pull off the Anne of Cleves marriage by himself. It would not have happened without the assistance of Henry's trusted artist, Hans Holbein. Hans painted a portrait that Henry approved of, but during Henry's annulment, many people went on record to say that Anne looked nothing like the painting. If Henry believed he'd been tricked into marriage, why would Holbein not receive any of the blame? More to the point, why would Holbein continue to be commissioned by the royal family and the Britain's elite for years to come? Henry's temper and rather easygoing nature when it came to executing people he felt had done him wrong were no secret in England or the rest of Europe. Why would Hans Holbein risk the king's wrath to paint a portrait that looked nothing like the subject, knowing full well she would potentially be seen by the king in person? There's no way to prove just how accurate Holbein's portrait was, but his continued employment and lack of any sort of punishment when others were literally losing their heads seems telling. How Anne felt about any of this is a matter of simply guessing. However, when it comes to the fates of Henry's wives, Anne is the clear winner. Instead of living the doomed life as one of Henry's queens, she became his sister. She consented to the annulment immediately and received a generous settlement, including a number of properties like Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's childhood home. Henry wrote to her, stating, quote, "Right dear and right entirely beloved sister, you shall find us a perfect friend, content to repute you as our dearest sister. We shall endow you with 4,000 pounds of yearly revenue, signed your loving brother and friend, H.R. Just for reference, that's around 1.68 million pounds a year today. Combined with the jewels, plate, and furniture she was permitted to keep, Anne became the richest woman in England. Henry had made Anne not an ex-wife, but a sister, to ensure her position not only at court, but within the country, as she would henceforth be the most important woman in England after the king's own wife and daughters. Their annulment was not meant to be an embarrassment to her, it seemed, if, of course, you ignore all the accusations about her looks and smell, but it was a way for Henry to avoid remaining married to her without jeopardizing her social standing. She and Henry, bizarrely, remained on good terms. She even spent the following Christmas at Hampton Court Palace and danced with her replacement, Catherine Howard, her former maid. After Catherine's downfall and execution, the idea of Henry remarrying Anne was floated, but gained little traction. Some see Anne's noted dislike for Henry's next wife, Catherine Parr, as evidence of her bristling from the insult of not being taken back. On hearing of Henry's marriage, Anne reportedly stated that, quote, "Madame Parr is taking a great burden on herself." She also commented on the fact that she was much more attractive than Catherine. Take note that the person who recorded this, Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, did not disagree with her statement. Later in life, Anne would foster relationships with Henry's children from his first 3 marriages. She was part of Queen Mary I's coronation procession, and may have been present at her crowning in Westminster Abbey, but, owing to Mary's staunch Catholicism, Anne, quote, "converted to the Catholic Church, then withdrew from the public eye." She did, however, remain close with the Princess Elizabeth, so close, in fact, that she was accused of being involved in Wyatt's rebellion, a plot to take Mary off the throne and replace her with her half-sister, Elizabeth. This forced her move away from court, and Anne retired to Chelsea Old Manor, where she died, likely of cancer, on the 16th of July, 1557, at the age of 42, having never remarried. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, on the opposite side of Edward the Confessor's tomb. Her burial place has been described as, quote, "somewhat hard to find, but it's fitting for her status. More so when you consider the fact that none of Henry's other queens were buried in such an important building, which is a topic to be covered in another video coming soon." Anne had never returned to Cleves, and seemed content in her life of luxury and peace. She threw excellent parties, played a mean game of cards, and no one who knew her in her later life seemed to have a negative word to say about her. She outlived all of Henry's other wives, and became known as a generous, easygoing woman and a good housekeeper, which was considered much more of a compliment in the 16th century than you might find it today. So the divorced beheaded died, divorced beheaded survived rhyme doesn't truly encapsulate Anne's position. She was never technically divorced, as her marriage was annulled, and Catherine Parr, giving the title survived, would die 9 full years before Anne, while Anne lived on in contented good humor and wealth, making her the true survivor of Henry's circus of marital life. And as for being the ugly one, that also doesn't ring true. The scrutiny and importance placed on a woman's appearance today is its own disappointing and depressing topic, but it's been going on for centuries. And I have to point out that Anne's life and existence would be no less valid or important had she actually been what we would describe as ugly. But to be labeled with the word, no less hurtful 500 years ago than it is today, is unfair. It's also borderline comical when you consider what Henry VIII looked like in his later years. And yet somehow he has largely escaped the same label, and he's the one that gave it to her, blaming her appearance for his own self-perceived failings as a husband and a man. Anne is sometimes referred to as the Flanders mare, said to be a nickname given to her at court. However, this term was first recorded by the Bishop of Salisbury in the 17th century, showing how successful Henry was at convincing people his wife was hideous. They were even coming up with cruel nicknames for her 100 years after she died. Anne may not be a hugely important historical figure, but her story highlights an experience shared by women throughout history. Her entire life reduced down to her appearance only, without any thought or additional context. But now you know her true story, where she came from, what she did, what was done to her, and how she chose to live her life afterwards and make the best of a bad situation. Sometimes they refer to people as more than just a pretty face, and now you know that Anne was more than just an ugly one. This has been Crown and Kingdom. Thank you to Anne of Cleves for agreeing to be the subject of this video, to King Henry VIII for an unending supply of fresh content, and of course to you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to help me keep my channel growing. This is Margot Moore wishing you goodbye and good time.